What effect has the China shock had on the US economy? I'm joined by Professor David Autor from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. David, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Can you just start by explaining what do we mean by the China shock?
The China shock is a shorthand term for the very disruptive integration of China into Western trade, and specifically in the context of the United States, it refers to China's joining the World Trade Organization in 2001 and the surge of Chinese exports that this catalyzed. One way to see this is in 1991, about 0.25% of all US goods consumption was produced in China. By 2007, that was about 5%. So that's a 20-fold increase. So it's turned out to have been much more disruptive than people had anticipated, both in terms of the amount of job loss in manufacturing, but also the difficulty that people have had adjusting to that in terms of reemployment and regaining jobs and their prior earnings levels. We have this, kind of stereotype of which we've convinced ourselves that the U.S. labor market is just incredibly fluid, that the unemployment insurance in the U.S. is that you'll get reemployed almost instantly. In the period of China's rise in the 1990s and much more in the 2000s after China joined the World Trade Organization, we saw a very rapid decline of manufacturing in sectors in which China had rising comparative advantage, mostly labor-intensive production like shoes, textiles, leather goods. And the workers who lost jobs in that time suffered sustained earnings losses. They didn't transition rapidly back into other employment. And in general, the areas where that manufacturing was going on, we saw kind of overall economic decline and malaise.
Traditionally, economists have argued that global trade is a good thing for economies. Why have they said that? And was there any evidence previously that that was actually the case?
So it is a good thing for global economies, and our work does not refute that point. Free trade among consenting nations, should in general raise income in all of them. They should raise GDP. But what's true for the country as a whole isn't necessarily true for every worker or individual in the country. Mm-hmm. The benefits in general will be small and diffuse and broadly shared. So lower prices of consumer goods, more variety of goods, perhaps a faster rate of product innovation because you can outsource and draw on scale economies elsewhere in the world, a reallocation of activity into things that your country is particularly good at, whether that's exporting aircraft or making food or clothing or whatever. However, the individuals who are in the sectors that become directly exposed to competition, they're generally going to, almost necessarily their sectors are going to shrink, right? We're just not going to be producing cheap textiles or, we're not going to be assembling toys in the United States anymore. Those impacts tend to stay localized. Instead of just the wages falling a little bit for people who have manual dexterous skills, we see just big job losses for the individuals at those plants, and then the whole communities in which that surround them just kind of, I don't want to say they implode, but they go into something of a state of decay. There's no contradiction in saying that, opening to trade, increases the size of the economic pie by a few percent, and yet kind of shrinks some slices by 10 or 20 or 30%. That's quite possible for that to occur.
Before we saw this big rise in China's role in global trade, there had been trade, but it was more between the US and countries in Europe. What was different about that sort of trade?
When China became a really productive, low-cost manufacturing country, it wasn't trying to create new products. It was basically trying to take existing products and make them much less expensively, right? There was nothing that was being made in China 15 years ago that wasn't previously made in some rich country, 15 years earlier than that. And that's fine. That that has many benefits, but it does mean it's going to have, instead of allowing countries to sort of specialize in things they're really going to work good at, it's just they're going to have to close down sectors in which they all of a sudden no longer have cost advantage. I don't want to cast a value judgment. China's trade has been enormously good, not just for China, but for the rest of the world, right? Not only has it brought 400 million Chinese out of poverty, but it's created wealth throughout Central and South America. It's created a commodity boom. China has invested in sub-Saharan Africa in ways that the West has just ignored. So it actually has reduced inequality in net by bringing up so much of the lower tail. It has also created challenges for some trading nations. If you ask me, would I vote yay or nay for trade with China, I would say yes, of course. The benefits on any global scale vastly outweigh the costs.
You've talked entirely here about the rise of China, but obviously the other thing that's been going on affecting manufacturing in the past few decades is increased automation.
Sure.
Can you be sure in your work that this is China and not automation?
So automation is a very important factor in the overall decline of manufacturing as a share of all economic activity. Output has been rising, productivity has been rising, that saves labor. And that has been a steady trend since the end of the Second World War. Still, numerically, it actually has been relatively steady. So there were 17 million manufacturing jobs at the end of World War II. There were 19 million manufacturing jobs in 1999. So the number had actually risen, although the share of the US has fallen. And then between 1999 and 2011, 30% of those jobs were lost. That was the kind of over the cliff fall that is very unlikely to be just the direct result of automation, and certainly not automation in labor-intensive manufacturing. Doesn't mean automation hasn't been important. If you say, since 1980, which has been more important to the decline of US manufacturing, automation, or China, I would say automation. If you said since the year 2000, I would say China.
So far, all your work has focused on what's happened in the US, but it feels like quite similar types of discontents are arising in other countries, and certainly in Britain, when we had the vote on the EU referendum last year.
Sure.
There was a much stronger vote to leave the EU in the former industrial heartlands of the North. Do you think your results carry over to other countries like Britain?
Yeah. In our work, we see this for US voters, but there's work in the UK looking at Brexit. There's work in Germany looking at voting for far-right parties. And all of them seem to affirm this idea that the trade-impacted areas are politically polarized or increasingly just moving to the right.
You said in your previous answer, I think if I was interpreting you correctly, that you wouldn't roll back the openness of trade to China.
I mean, part of the reason that the shocks are so disruptive is because they can happen so quickly. And the same change occurring over a longer period of time, it's much easier for people to adjust to it. I think if we had known just how fast things would change with China's accession to the WTO, joining the WTO, we might have tried to slow that down. In fact, there were some provisions that were put into that agreement that were negotiated by the Clinton administration, and then the Bush administration had no interest in using those provisions because they were seen as protectionist.
And is there anything else that you think, looking back at the experience with China, that any other policies that governments could have resorted to actually make it a little bit easier on them?
Yeah. I don't think trade has a higher moral standing than other forms of job loss. But I think we should do more in the United States to help workers make successful adjustments when they lose employment, either through training or through wage top-ups or through job search assistance. We do very little, partly based on our somewhat erroneous belief that everyone is implicitly insured by the perfect neoclassical US labor market where there are no frictions and no involuntary unemployment, and everyone's just has to name their price and they get a job.
David, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much.
with us your lessons from China's rise on the US economy.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the questions.